Imagine for just a moment that it's December 31st, it's nearing the new year, the clock is counting down, and suddenly in the middle of in the middle of that night, around 11 or so, you get a visit from God himself. And he says to you on December 31st, whatever it is that is your heart's desire, I will give to you for this next year. Name it and it is yours. I'm not much of a name it and claim it kind of guy, right? But just imagine that this was God and he comes to you and says, name whatever it is that your heart desires, what will it be? And I will give it to you in 2025. What would that be for you? What would that desire be? If you're familiar with your Old Testament, you probably would say, well, that has happened before. Something similar like that, to that has happened once before, and that was in 1 Kings. When Solomon was visited by God, and he promised that he would give him whatever it is that he asked, and Solomon answered the right way. He didn't ask for women, he didn't ask for money, he didn't ask for status, he didn't ask for power, he didn't ask for any of those things. What he asked for was, somebody help me out here, wisdom. Good, you are familiar with your Old Testament, right? So he asked for wisdom. He says, give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people? It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. Now I'm sure that most of us would like to at least think that we would be like Solomon. That we would probably follow in his footsteps. That we too would ask for wisdom and understanding so that we could govern our lives, maybe oversee and govern our families the way that they ought to be governed, discerning between the good and the evil. Some of us probably do on a regular basis pray that God would give us wisdom. Some of us have gotten into the habit maybe of reading through Proverbs. There's a proverb, 31 Proverbs, one chapter for every single day. Maybe some of us have gotten into the habit of reading through a chapter of Proverbs every single day because somehow maybe one of them will rub off on us. And we might be able to live a little bit more wisely. But how many of us actually stop to ground our lives in that wisdom? In the wisdom of the Proverbs. We're not just trying to read through one a day, but we are stopping to meditate on them, read them and then meditate on them. And then to seek in our lives, to think through how in the world, what situation might I be in today or tomorrow that I may be able to put this proverb into action. That I might be able to think through this proverb. How should I respond? What does this reveal about my character and how should I respond to other people when this kind of situation comes up? How many of us have thought, I need the Proverbs to actually govern my life, how I spend my money, how I choose my friends, how maybe we understand and stand up for justice. I've heard a lot of New Year's resolutions. I've made a lot of New Year's resolution in my day. And unfortunately, I don't think I've ever heard, nor have I ever actually made a resolution that in the coming year I would like to be a wiser man, a wiser pastor, a better husband, not wiser, a better father, but not wiser. I've never heard anybody say it. I've never said it actually myself. I've never made that kind of New Year's resolution to be wiser, to live more wisely. So on the one hand, I would like to think that I would be more like Solomon, that I would agree with Solomon. If God came to me on December 31st, 2024, I would say, yes, this is what I want, God. I want to be a wiser man. I would like to think that's what I would choose. But based on what I've already chosen my resolutions to be throughout the years, I don't know if I would actually choose that or not. As we begin this series on Proverbs this morning, I want to use this time to introduce the book of Proverbs to you. Some of this might be new to you, some of it may not be as new. But my hope is that today you'll be more fully equipped to read the Proverbs and glean life lessons and timeless truths that you may live them throughout your life, throughout this next year. In order to do that, I want us to see three qualifiers of Proverbs. That first qualifier is the aim of Proverbs. The second qualifier is the audience of Proverbs. The aim of Proverbs, the audience of Proverbs, and then finally the last thing is the advancement of Proverbs. The aim, the audience, the advancement of Proverbs. So if you will, please stand with me for the honor of the reading of God's Word. We're going to read the first 7 verses here this morning. Again, that's page 494 if you're using the Pew Bible. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing and righteousness, justice and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Thank you. You may be seated. So that first qualifier that comes out in Proverbs that I want us to look at is really the one the aim of Proverbs. And I call this a qualifier. I call these qualifiers because qualifiers, as you may well know, are those things that limit the scope of that which is being qualified. In this case, it's Proverbs that's being qualified. And we need to understand that there is a limitation to the scope of Proverbs. And the first qualifier there, the first limitation of it, is the aim of it. It is setting out, Solomon and those who have written the Proverbs are setting out to deliver to us a purpose, a goal in mind. If we're not using Proverbs according to the aim, we're going to come up short when it comes to Proverbs. We're going to misunderstand what they are. So the first aim that we need to understand is that Proverbs are not promises. Proverbs are not promises. If we think of Proverbs as promises, we are going to be sorely disappointed. We're going to be disenfranchised. May even be disgusted with God. God, your word says in Proverbs such and such that if this happens, then that will happen. It didn't happen. Your word is wrong. It's not true. In fact, it was the exact opposite of what I was expecting to happen. And many people have lost their faith or have had their faith weakened or maybe shaken because they looked at the Proverbs and they read the Proverbs, they understood the Proverbs wrongly. They were taught that the Proverbs of the Bible are promises of God, and they are not promises of God. It is inspired certainly by God, but they're not the promises of God. Instead, Proverbs are pithy sayings of general truths. Pithy sayings of general truths. Pithy simply means short and to the point. There's a lot of punch when it comes to the Proverbs. There's a lot of punch and a little bit of words and a few words. Short sayings that pack a lot of punch about general truths. That's really what Proverbs are. And so when Solomon says that his aim in the Proverbs is to this and that and this and that, he is saying that these are like short sayings of general truths that we may grow in our wisdom. So what are those things that he is talking about? You look at 2, 3, 4, and 6. Look at those verses, 2, 3, 4, and 6. We see that word "to" quite often in those verses. In Hebrew, there's more than one way to say "to." One of the most common ways is the word "li." It's basically L-I. Li, it's a prefix preposition. In other words, it is taken and it attaches itself to the beginning of a Hebrew word, and it just simply means "to." But when it does that, it's more about giving the direction rather than the motion. It's more about giving direction than motion. There are other words that would typically be more for motion. The word L would be more towards motion. I'm walking to church. I am walking to this place. I am going to read this book. Those are all motions. Lit, on the other hand, typically will be utilized for the direction. It points us somewhere. In this case, it points us to wisdom and to understanding and those kinds of things. So we read to know wisdom, to understand, to receive instruction, to give prudence, to understand a proverb. Those are all directed points. The aim of Proverbs then is to point us in direction of growing inwardly, in other words, growing spiritually or in character. That is the point. That is the aim of Proverbs. If we are reading it for a different aim, we're going to be sorely disappointed. Those who are looking for the outcome part of the Proverbs, rather than the inward changes that they are pointing to, we need to understand that if that's you, that those things are not the guaranteed outcome. Of course, the always is the one that comes up, Proverbs 22:6. Right? Bring up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The question that we should be asking it is my child is my child going to depart, but am I bringing them up in the way that they should go? Generally speaking, they will not depart from it, but that is not the promise of God. So as we study and we meditate upon and we engage the Proverbs, we need to first ask ourselves, first and foremost, what inward part of me is this proverb pointing out? What character in my life is this proverb pointing to? Is this pointing to how I view relationships, whether that's friendships or whether that's marriage, whether that's how I deal with my children or even how I might deal with my enemies? Is this my character issue of relationships? Is this pointing to how I view emotions, whether it's anger or depression or joy or some other way? How do I view those emotions? Is this pointing to how I deal with wealth, my thoughts, my values, and what it means to have money or not have money, poverty or riches? That's the question that we should be asking. What is this proverb pointing to? What characteristic is this proverb pointing to? How is it supposed to help me grow spiritually? Don't look to Proverbs to show actual outcomes, to predict the outcomes, because that's not the aim of the proverb. When we look for outcome, rather than insight, we are doing something akin to looking for the gift rather than the giver. So rather than looking for the gift instead of the giver, may we love the giver no matter what the gift may be. And let us run after insight no matter what the outcome may be. Let me give you one last aim of Proverbs. It is to point us in a general direction, but then it often moves to a specific direction. It goes from general to specific. It moves from general to specific. We call this parallelism. We've talked a lot about parallelism over the past few weeks. Parallelism is this part of Hebrew poetry in which you have the sayings that are going to be generally the same thing, and they're going to say it twice. They're just going to say it slightly differently. Psalm 51:2 is the one that often comes up. We could look at this. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Wash and cleanse, basically the same thing, are they not? They're synonymous. Iniquity and sin, basically the same thing. They're pretty synonymous. So that's parallelism. David is saying in that psalm the same thing. He's saying it twice to make a point. Proverbs is like that, though it's not exactly like that. Generally speaking, it will go from it goes from general to specific. It takes us one step above. So that's why it's actually called step parallelism. It takes us one step above. where it was. So it goes from general all the way to specific. So we see in verses 2, 3, and 4, we'll see that it does this. We go from wisdom and instruction to words of insight. That's actually step parallelism. It's not just wisdom and instruction about any and all, everything. We're not going to find instruction in here about how to build a boat. But it is giving us something that goes towards insight, something that we use so that we can then inwardly see. Give me one, I'll give you one more. Prudence to the simple. What does it mean to have prudence to the simple? What does he mean he's trying to give prudence to the simple? He says it in the very next verse. Prudence to the simple, and then he says what? Knowledge and discretion to the youth. What does he mean by simple? He means young people. What does he mean by prudence? He means knowledge and direction. It's step parallelism. And so we see this happens quite often within the Proverbs. There are other types of parallelism that's in there as well. There is the parallel of opposites in there as well. Oftentimes it'll say the wise do this, the foolish do that. Those are opposites. But oftentimes it is this step parallelism. We need to take a look at this and see why he is going from general to specific, that we don't just simply take the general by itself, but we actually look more towards the specific. Because that's when it cuts to the heart of the matter. But this takes us to that second qualifier of Proverbs. First is the aim of Proverbs. Second is the audience of Proverbs. And this may surprise you, but Proverbs is not actually written for everybody. We like to think that maybe it's written for everybody, but it talks about how it's not written for everybody. We'll get to that in just a second. We see that there are actually three audiences. Two of them are types of people that the Proverbs are written to. The third one is the type of person that it is not written to. And that first person that the Proverbs is written to is the wise. You may actually come across other words that it uses for to speak of the wise in various ways. The righteous, or the blameless, the mature, the humble, those kinds of things. If it's a positive situation, if it's a positive word, then you're looking more towards those who are the wise. This is who it's written to. It's the first type of audience that Proverbs has in mind when it wants to grow in insight and living. This was actually Solomon himself. He had to be pretty wise if you were going to ask for wisdom. You had to realize that you didn't know everything. You had to realize that you're in a situation that needed wisdom, that you needed to ask God for his help. You need to ask God for his wisdom. So that's exactly what Solomon does in 1 Kings 3. He sees that he is not quite there yet. The only way that he can govern with justice, the only way that he can discern between good and bad is to ask for wisdom. That in and of itself is wisdom coming out. First and foremost, the Proverbs say that wisdom, that the wise are listeners. It's not that these people never talk. It's just simply that they listen more than they talk. They realize that they don't know everything and they shouldn't speak to everything. Again, we see in the Proverbs that the parallelism here. One, the wise is the one who understands. Verse 5, let the wise hear and increase in learning. The one who understands obtain guidance. So the wise are those who understand. The learning is actually obtaining guidance. And actually what Solomon wrote here is that the wise will buy counsel. They will buy their advice. That's why the name of this the name of this sermon is Wisdom at All Cost. We need to buy wisdom. It's worth paying for. Oftentimes, financial gurus, if you've ever gone through Financial Freedom University by Dave Ramsey, others will do this as well. What they will often tell us is that if you want to grow in your wealth, then what you need to do is you need to find someone who is one step above you in that wealth. So if you have about $10,000 saved up in the bank, you probably should go to somebody that more like has $50,000, maybe $100,000 saved up in the bank and say, hey, how did you actually get there? How were you able to save that $50,000? How were you able to save that $100,000? Take them out to lunch. Dave Ramsey would say, what you need to do is you need to find out how much somebody makes within an hour, what they make on an hourly rate, and say, hey, I will pay you your hourly rate, and I will take you out to lunch. I will buy your lunch. I will pay you for your wisdom so that I can grow in my understanding of how to acquire wealth. That's the same idea that Solomon is talking about here. We need to be willing to pay for the wisdom that other people have. We need to find other people who are wiser than we and ask them, take them out to lunch, ask them how we should live, and maybe even if we have to, pay them for it, because wisdom is worth the money. Free advice is often cheap advice. We need to understand that. We must take care to go to those who are wise if we want to grow in our wisdom. The wise, the prudent, the mature. We ought not go to just anyone for advice. We need to go to them, go to the wise, and then do as they say. There's a second audience, though, that the Proverbs is written for. The simple. Again, there are different words that might use in Proverbs for those in this category. The simple, the young, the youth, the ignorant, the naive. Sometimes we might think of those things as bad things, but they're not. They're more neutral ideas, neutral sayings. They just don't know any better. That's what ignorant means, right? They just don't know any better. They haven't learned yet. They're naive. They're young. They're simple-minded. They're neutral types. They tend to be influenced rather easily. They could go, they could listen to wisdom and go with wisdom. They could listen to foolishness and go with foolishness. They're just kind of in the middle. They're really not, they haven't grown up yet. Generally, we find the naive or the simple that way because they are so young. They're still in their adolescence. They're still teenagers. Maybe their frontal lobe has not yet fully developed. I think they say now it's like 25, 26 years old. They're going to make some silly mistakes, some awful sins. Sometimes they'll surprise us and they'll do something that is unbelievably wise. They're in the middle there. We see this as an example in the book of Kings as well. Solomon's son Rehoboam. We tend to think that he was a rebel, and he did turn out to be very rebellious and extremely foolish. But we see at the very beginning of his reign, Jeroboam and some people come to him and they say, hey, if you will relieve the burden of Solomon, all the taxes and such that Solomon has given to us, we will follow you forever. And we see that Rehoboam actually does something pretty well off, right? He goes to his father's advisors and says, what should I do? And they give him the advice. And then after that, then he goes to his friends and says, what should I do? And they give him that advice. And he decides that he will listen to his friends rather than the well-aged advisors of his father. He had a choice to make, and he was easily influenced by the pride and the puffed upness that his friends gave to him. He was easily influenced that way. And he made a decision that ripped the kingdom in two. And he continued to make those decisions, which led him into that third category. That Proverbs actually is not really written to those who are foolish. It's not for the foolish. It's not that the foolish can't read Proverbs or that we wouldn't really necessarily even want the foolish to read Proverbs. It's that the foolish will get nothing from the Proverbs. They will ignore them. They will scoff at them. So there's really no point in the foolish looking for the Proverbs. We see this in verse 7. At the end of verse 7, he says, fools despise wisdom and instruction. And again, this category can include a whole bunch of different words. Fools, those who are rebellious, the unrighteous, the wicked. We would love for them to read the Proverbs, but the problem is their hearts are so hardened against God and against His Word, they generally don't get anything out of it. And if they do, it's not the right thing. The negative terms, not the neutral terms, not the positive terms, but the negative terms we see referring to those in this category. This is their way of life. Now, we will make foolish decisions. Don't get me wrong. We will make foolish decisions. That does not make us fools. We may be naive. We may actually be wise people who sometimes might make foolish decisions, but that does not put us in that foolish category because that's not our way of life. We are not living in rebellion as a way of life. We're not living in hardness of heart as a way of life. It is simply our sin nature getting the best of us, and we fall into that temptation. None of us are perfect. Not an excuse, just the reason why we would do it. Fools live a life of rebellion. That's why they are called wicked. They don't want to grow up inwardly. They don't want to grow up spiritually. They think that they know it all. That's why they don't listen. They see no need to buy wisdom or counsel or advice. They can handle any situation that comes their way. The rich man who built his new barns is an example of a fool. Remember, he acquired so much wealth, so much grain, that he decided on his own. He didn't seek counsel. He didn't ask anybody for advice. He just simply said to himself, "Soul, this is what I will do." He didn't want to hear from anybody. He didn't ask anybody. He just simply did his own thing. And the response we see in Luke chapter 12, verse 20, it says, "But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?'" A fool, even if somebody had gone to them and given them advice, would not have listened. That's why it's not really for them. Doesn't mean we don't give them the advice. Doesn't mean we say, "Hey, you know what? Ignore Proverbs." We don't do that. But we need to go in understanding that they will not listen. Which leads us into that third qualifier for Proverbs. So the first is the aim. Second is the audience. The third is the advancement of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs in the Bible is not the only, obviously, it's not the only set of Proverbs in the world. There are tons of them. Most religions have Proverbs, some type of Proverbs. The secular world has Proverbs. If you ever heard the proverb, one in the hand is worth two in the bush, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, then you know a proverb from Benjamin Franklin. If you've ever heard the proverb, "A stitch in time may save nine," that comes from Thomas Fuller. This one surprised me when I was looking up the history of these proverbs. When in Rome, what? Do as the Romans do. This one surprised me. You know who said that? Anybody know? No? It was Bishop Ambrose, back in the 4th century, that said that. Bishop Ambrose said that. And what he meant was, actually, it got a little bit changed up over time, but what he meant was, when he was talking, he says, "When I am in Milan, I do not fast on Saturdays. But when I am in Rome, I do fast on Saturdays, because that's what the Roman Church does." And so the saying is, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. It's actually the Roman Church. Do as the Roman Church does. I thought that was interesting. But as great as these adages are, these proverbs can be, the advantage goes actually to the biblical book of Proverbs. Because the biblical book of Proverbs is the chief among all proverbs. Verse 7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." And then, of course, fools despise the wisdom and instruction. Before we go any further, we, of course, need to see again that this is parallelism. This is the parallel of opposites. Again, because we see the very beginning, the fear of the Lord is opposite of despising. Knowledge is the opposite of wisdom and instruction. We can tell by what we've read in the first 6 verses that it is the wise who actually do fear the Lord. It is the fool then who does not. That's understood. So we go back and hearken back to the audience. We know that really there are only those two people that it might be talking about: the wise, the naive. The naive can certainly fear the Lord as well. It's just that's not how they always are. The wise already fear the Lord. And again, this doesn't mean that we're terrified of Yahweh God. What it does mean is that we give him the reverence that he deserves. We give him all due respect. Remember how the wise, they want to listen more than they talk? We want to hear from God more than just talk to him, as if we know what we're supposed to do. They are willing to buy advice and counsel. That's how important wisdom is to them. They realize that the best counsel is godly counsel. And so here the author here, Solomon, says that the fear of the Lord, that's those who are wise, listen. They listen to his instruction because that's where their knowledge comes from. They know that they should be going to the one who is all wise, all knowing, all powerful, all present, all wondrous King of this universe. Therefore, before all Proverbs, whether they're secular or religious, we go to God's Proverbs. For all other wisdom, before we go to and seek the advice of gurus and wise men and philosophers, we turn to God if we want to grow, if we want to advance, because there is no advancement like the advancement of the book of Proverbs. It deals with practically every single area and aspect of life. The fool, however, again, does not fear the Lord, does not give him the respect that he deserves. No amount of reading of the Proverbs is going to do any good. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning, it's the first step in a long marathon of knowledge that comes from the Lord. If we do not begin with the reverence of God and his word, we will never end up with the true wisdom that word provides. So what does that mean for you and me? Really means nothing less than actually going to Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And do not lean on your own understandings, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. And what so often happens, beloved, is that we fail to trust God. We fail to trust his direction. We have these moments of cognitive dissonance when we hold these two opposing views at the same time. On the one hand, we treat the Proverbs like promises. On the other hand, we treat the Proverbs like preferences. We want to acquire the outcome, but we don't want to acquiesce to the insight. Church family, there is an advancement that can be made in the Proverbs. These words of wisdom can absolutely change our lives if we come at them trusting that God knows what he's talking about. It is absolutely fine to come in naive and simple. Come to the Proverbs when you're naive and simple. Absolutely do it. It's written to advance the simple. It's written to take the simple, to take the naive, to take the youthful, to make them into wise men and women and children. We need to come in our naivete and learn, trusting that God knows exactly what he's talking about. That he knows what is best. Even if we don't understand it, he does. We do not come, again, looking for those outcomes. Because the outcomes are possibilities, not promises. The truth, though, is that you will never regret submitting to God's wisdom. It always advances those who fear, revere, trust him. So as we come to the end of this message, we know that January 1st is only a few days away. What would it look like? What would it be like if we were to make a resolution to be wiser men or women, even children, on December 31st. That we would look and say, by the end of December 31st, at December 31st, 2025, I want to have lived and known and grown in my wisdom. That I might live as a wiser husband, a wiser father, a wiser mother or wife, a wiser church member, a wiser believer, a wiser student, a wiser employee. What if that was our resolution for the coming year? What if we were to resolve to trust God's direction and then trust Him to make our paths straight? We've seen that the aim of Proverbs is to point us to wisdom, to understanding, to insight, that we would look inwardly. It's to point us. It doesn't move us. We must move by the grace of God, but it points us that direction. Those Proverbs are there because we need to see ourselves. We need to see our own character, our own thoughts, our own ways of doing things, and see, do these line up with what God says is true, what God means for us to be. We've seen that the Proverbs, the audience of the Proverbs are marked by two categories: those who are wise, the mature, the righteous, and then the simple, the naive, the youthful. The wise are already on this road to wisdom. Their paths are being made straight. They trust the Lord. Their paths are being made straight. They may get off every once in a while, but for the most part, they're staying on that path. The naive are the ones who have yet maybe begun. They're basically clean slates. They're easily influenced. But they're looking for advice. They're looking for counsel. They're just not yet there to always take God's advice, God's counsel. And then finally, we've seen the advancement of Proverbs for those who fear the Lord. That if we want to grow in our understanding, we must first submit ourselves. I love what Augustine at one point says. He says, I believe in order to understand. We may not understand. We need only believe, and the understanding will come. If we want to grow in our understanding, we first submit ourselves to Yahweh God, admitting that we don't have that understanding as we ought. Our understandings are corrupted by sin, but only God has understanding that is not, that He can look at this world without bias, without prejudice, without cracked lenses. The Proverbs will advance us in seeing the world the way that God does. But we have to trust Him in order to do it. Of course, Christ Jesus is absolutely our example in this. Luke tells us that Jesus grew, and he tells us He didn't just grow in stature, but he tells us that Jesus grew in stature and in wisdom. We know that He grew in intelligence, but it wasn't just intelligence that He grew in wisdom. The wisdom of God personified is Christ. And yet He had to grow into wisdom just as much as we do. And if God the Son needed to grow in wisdom in His mortal flesh, who are we to think that we can go in this world without doing the same? Who are we to think that we can grow in our Christian life without doing the same? Let's pray.